wait just another minute, see if anybody else joins us. And we'll get going and finishing our chapter on manipulative skills. Okay, so we're going to finish the chapter that we started before spring break. So, it's been a week and a half since we looked at that initial information, so hopefully the brain can dig that out a little bit so that the remainder of the chapter is flowing through. Wednesday will be our review session for exam 2, and Friday, no, wait, that's not right, this is a Tuesday-Thursday class. So Thursday will be the review session for exam 2, and next Tuesday will be the exam. That must be right. Check your syllabus just in case I'm talking nonsense, but I think that's correct. Okay, so we're going to start looking at catching, which is quite an interesting skill when you take into account all the anticipation and perception concepts. So here we go. Any questions before I get going on this?
No, ma'am.
No? Okie dokie. All right, so again, we're going to look at fundamental levels of these skills, right? So we're looking at trying to get competency at a fundamental level so that if we wanted to, we can then learn more complicated versions of these motor skills, all right? So manipulative skills are anywhere I'm going to gain control over an object. Remember the previous chapter was ballistic skills, so those were skills where I was applying force to an object to send it somewhere else. Now I'm receiving an object. Catching is the most common one of these. There's not as much information on catching as there is on throwing, but we have quite a bit to look at here. So often in a sporting context in particular, we're wanting to catch the ball with our hands and manipulate the ball either to hang on to it and run with it in rugby or American football, I think they do that. Or I need to be able to catch it, manipulate it, and pass it on to the next person. Okay? So what makes catching much, much more difficult from a learning and a developmental point of view is that whereas with throwing I have the object, right? So I'm in control. With catching, I have to not only manipulate what shape my hands are going to be, but I have to be in the correct place to intercept that ball, right? So that makes it much more difficult for the brain. So typically we would see Developmentally, we're going to see throwing and better stages of throwing before we see good, consistent attempts at catching. All right, so it's a reception skill. And as I say, catching is the most common. It's not the only one, though. If you think about in soccer, receiving a ball that's been passed by a teammate is also a reception skill. It would be a manipulative skill. All right? But we know the most about catching out of the group of manipulative skills. And when you are looking at TGMD and MSU chart characteristics, often what we find is that if a child scores well, it's because the person who tossed or threw the ball did a very good job at putting the ball in exactly the right place, rather than the child did a very good job of catching. All right, particularly when we're looking at fundamental catching, because typically in the early stages we don't see any movement from the child. Right, so that means that I've got to do a good job, not me, because I try to get someone else to do the tossing for catching TGMD, because I'm not good at that. I can't put the ball in the right place. Okay. So a reminder then from our early work in lab about what fundamental catching looks like. Initially, no foot movement, arms are out, very rigid. They may not even track the ball, and they wait until the ball hits their arms to try to pull it in. All right? There's not much force absorption going on. Occasionally we will get an image where the child is like leaning away from the ball. Sometimes their eyes are shut. So we'll talk about that concept later on when we look at perceptual information. But when you see this, you know the brain is not processing this visual stimulus appropriately yet, right? This ball is coming in and the image is getting bigger on the retina, so the brain knows the ball is coming, but it doesn't know what to do yet, so it kind of pulls the head out of the way. With more experience, more practice, with some good modeling, then what we're going to see happen with the arms and the hands is hopefully going to change to be much more effective. All right, so for a start, we're looking for a transition from catching with the arms to putting the hands up and making the attempt to catch with the hands. Okay, and then once we've got some consistency with making contact with the ball, remember we've got to absorb that force. So if you go back to chapter 3, we want to increase the amount of time that we're absorbing the force for, right? So we make contact and we often, the cue is to pull the ball in towards your chest or your stomach, right? So that you absorb that force, because otherwise the ball is going to hit your hand and bounce back out again if your hands are just stuck there, right? Your hands have to take in that force. And then we're going to start to see some movement from side to side, forwards and backwards to get into the right place to intercept the ball. And there's a lot going on in the brain there to work out where do I need to be to intercept this ball, all right? And eventually someone is going to understand that, if the ball's coming in a big loop, they need their hands up here. If the ball's coming in low, they're going to have to rotate their hands and have their fingers down to catch that ball effectively. So our good old idea of this observation plan, all right? Hopefully you spent a little bit of time looking at these, because that's coming up now as a assignment pretty quickly, all right? Remember that they've got the developmental sequence first of all, so they have to choose which are the important characteristics for that skill, all right? And then create a mini MSU chart for that characteristic. So we've got arm action, hand action, body action, okay? And I thought they had foot action, but maybe not. Okay, and the observation plan for catching is not validated, so we don't have heaps of film and analysis behind it, but it's the proposed developmental sequence for catching. And again, the people that put this together have a lot of experience with fundamental motor skills, so it's probably pretty accurate way to look at these. All right. So arm action. Do the arms move to adapt to the ball arrival? Remember, we're looking for a question that has preferably a yes, no, but at least only two answers, right? It can be answer A or answer B, all right? So, because once we get to our observation plan, then we want to be able to use this as a visual assessment tool, right? So it's got to be very simple. I see it or I don't see it. Right, same idea as the TGMD. Is it there, is it not there? Yes, no. Okay? So, do the arms move to adapt to the ball arrival? Yes, no. If it's no, there's not a lot going on, and so little response, this would be step one. So it looks very similar to what we would see on our MSU chart. Right? If it's a yes, the arms are moving to adapt to the ball coming in, then we need to ask some more questions to find out what's happening, right? So, is the ball trapped against the chest or caught in the hands? So if it's trapped or in the hands, okay? So, this is not yes, no, but it's still a one or the other. Okay? If the hands are going in first, then the arm action is finished. All right? So that would be step 4. But if it's trapping in to the chest, then we've got, if you again go back to our MSU chart, we've got a couple of different things that could be happening with those arms. Okay? Are they encircling, hugging the ball? Or are they scooping the ball to their chest? All right? So we have a step 2 hugging and a step 3 scooping. Right. Then they have a hand action. So do the palms face inward, or are they facing up or facing down? Right, so this is not very effective for catching, so this would be step 1. Okay. And you have to be a little bit flexible here with this hand action idea. Because if you can drag your memory back to before spring break, we were looking at the idea that the hand shape changes in the reach to be the right shape to pick up the object or catch the object. So it's going to be the same here, right? What my hands are doing is going to depend on what the ball is, right? Is it a great big beach ball? Is it a tennis ball? Is it a rugby ball or an American football? Because my hand shape might be different to catch an egg-shaped ball than a round ball, right? I have have no experience at that, so I don't know. But maybe if we were filming that, we would see a different hand shape in the reach, in the perception, in the interception phase, right? So, do the hands adjust to the flight and size of the ball? Yes, no. And then the third one is the body. So is the body moving? Is the body stationary? All right. So our developmental changes would very much depend on the constraints that we were putting in place. There's much more variety in catching and throwing, right? So the kind of surface that I'm on is going to make quite a lot more difference to a catcher than it is to a pitcher, right? The weather is going to make a lot more difference. What kind of ball it is will make a difference, right? So if you look at no, that's not what I want. Okay, hold on. If you think about how do I know where the ball is going, right? So this is an interesting, frustrating for me, but it's an interesting idea with any interception skill, is if you don't know where the ball is likely to go, right? If you don't have enough experience with it to understand the flight of the ball, then it's very difficult to move in time to catch the ball. So sometimes it's not my catching, my manipulation skill that's the problem, it's the understanding of the interception of the ball that's the problem, right? So for me, this is one of the frustrating things in tennis. I love tennis, but I didn't play very much when I was young because I was a dancer and a gymnast. And so what I find when I'm playing is that, especially when I haven't been very consistent at getting out to the court, right? So instead of playing twice a week, I play once every 2 months, right? What I find is that I have to wait for the ball to almost cross the net before I understand where it's likely to bounce and I can move. So often I miss the ball because I just waited too long to move towards the ball. When I watch someone who's quite good at tennis, right, then they're moving sometimes, especially if you watch international players, they're moving as the opponent is striking the ball. They already know from the racket position and the body turn of the other player where that ball is likely to be on the court. So they can move much, much, much sooner and be there for the ball when it hits the floor. Right? Does that make sense? So that interception idea, that kind of understanding of ball flight and ball movement is something that takes a lot of practice for your brain to put together, right? So it's not just the striking or the manipulation, it's the understanding of the ball flight as well, right? So I have to understand where the ball is going to be. I have to, not consciously, but my brain has to understand what shape it's going to make my hands to catch whatever object it is. Also, I have to understand how fast is the ball moving towards me, right? How hard was that ball hit or thrown? Okay? So then how much force do I have to be prepared to absorb when I make contact with the ball? Right? So you can hopefully start to see why catching is, from a developmental point of view, much more complicated than throwing, although throwing is biomechanically much more complicated than catching. Right? So when we're assessing catching, it's very important that we keep all the constraints the same from the pre to the post. Okay, so this can be a little bit tricky. It takes a little bit of thought to know how you want to set this up. Okay, because with catching, it's interesting. It's much easier to catch a big, soft, floaty type ball, right? But we're going to see much lower levels on the developmental sequence by using a big, floaty ball, right? Really, you want something that's kind of, I don't know, maybe softball, baseball, tennis ball type size. Okay, so if you have a look at the TGMD, they give you the sizes of the ball to use. And so if I want to look at the process, of catching, then I might use a smaller ball. Now the problem with using a smaller ball is if the person's not very good at catching, they're likely to not manage the task. And then you have to do a good job of motivating them to keep trying, right? So do I want to look at the process, the developmental sequence, what they're actually doing, or does the only thing that counts how many times they can catch the ball out of a set, right? So I can look at the product, the outcome, the catch versus drop, or I can look at the process, the developmental sequence, and see what's actually happening. So who am I, right? Who's the person I'm assessing? If I'm the baseball coach at Eastern, do I care about the developmental sequence of catching, right? Probably not, because what I care about is whether they catch the ball or drop the ball, because that wins or loses the game, right? So the assessment tool that I'm going to use is going to depend on who I am, who I'm assessing, okay? And then I have to think about, do I want to assess them and possibly have them failing to begin with, and then practice catching, and then retest them after we've done a lot of practice and hopefully see an improvement, right? That's the way I would go. But you do have to remember that if you are throwing the ball and they're dropping it or missing it, right? Even at 4, they know that they were meant to catch the ball. And so it's a skill that it's quite hard, if you're going to work with people who are not very good at it, it's quite hard to keep the individual motivated to keep trying, right? Because remember, if I keep failing, if I fail, every time you throw the ball to me, I either miss it or I drop it. Eventually, I'm just going to go, stuff this, I'm going to go do something else, right? So you have to do a very good job as the teacher to keep them engaged and motivated. Right? So it's important that the pre-constraints are the same as the post-constraints, right? The trajectory of the ball, the size of the ball, the distance that you're tossing the ball from, all these things have to remain consistent from pre-test to post-test. Okay, so it's a really cool consider in relation to our constraints triangle, because we see very different movement patterns emerge for catching based upon the context, right? The environmental constraints and the task constraints. So if I can find, I have a feeling I do not have that link on the note page. No. All right, let me do this. Oops. What I want to show you. Okay, let's do this.
This is the checkers game where grandson and granddad will bond.
Okay, back here. Let's make this a new tab. Okay, so I don't know how much experience you guys have with cricket, so I'm going to show you some cricket, because I've probably got quite a lot of experience with the baseball idea, but let's look at something that might be a bit more novel for you.
Top 10 best catches in cricket history. Number 10.
It's easier in slow motion. Right, so that's a really good example of the idea of understanding where the ball is and being in the right place to intercept it. Right? He caught it in his fingers. That was pretty cool.
Number 8.
Okay, so that gives you an idea, hopefully, of some of the complexity of catching once we're past fundamental catching. The other thing I wanted to see if they had a bit of frisbee. Let's just do frisbee catching. Oh. Okay, let's try this one.
These are going to be way out big. There, how do you like that?
First into Hancock. Hancock puts it out to space. There's Breeze Stroud and Breeze Stroud fully extends and comes down with that one.
Rips it. Take off, boy.
Going for the goal.
Now,
Fair Baker.
go.
Baker.
Over the top.
All right, so a different, it's a bit difficult to see here, but that's like different hand shape to catch a frisbee than catch a cricket ball. Woo! That was a good one.
Great defense by Boston. You gotta give credit on that.
I would be so bad at this, it would be embarrassing. Oh, okay, so that was a cool one, because did you see how, like, if that had been a ball, there's no way probably that he would have got there, but because it's the frisbee and it's floating, he knew he had a little bit more time to get to that catch. So, yeah, cool stuff. Any questions to there?
No, ma'am. That looks cool.
It's cool, isn't it? All right, so again, it's just, think about all the time. Think about that triangle. Think about the fact that if I change one of the constraints, so I change it from a cricket ball to a frisbee, that's a task constraint because it's equipment, right? That the interaction of the constraints with the different constraint means I'm going to get a different movement pattern emerging to be successful at that new task. Okay? All right, so I've already mentioned that anticipation is important. I've got to be able to understand where I need to go to be in the right place, or where I need to move my hand to for my hand to be in the right place, right? So the manipulation may be fully developed before the ability to be in the right place, right? So that fundamental catching, right? I might be getting quite good at you catching with my hands when I don't have to move very much, but once I've got to move a greater distance and anticipate where I need to be, then we start to see someone who can catch the ball very well not catching the ball, right? So I change the constraint and we see something different occur, right? So remember that I have to initiate early that movement to be in the right place at the right time. Okay? So when the researchers are looking at this information, they're often looking at what we call coincidence anticipation tasks within a lab setup. So it's very controlled, very organized. You don't see so many studies at the moment, unfortunately, really out in the field, like actually looking at a softball or a baseball game, right? What's going on? I would like to see those kinds of studies more than these lab type ones, right? So coincidence anticipation task means that you set something up and the person has to anticipate where the object is going, or the light, it's often a light, is going to move. Where is it going to arrive? What's going to be the completion point? And then they film the arm and things like that to see what's happening with the brain. Right? So we often see improvement with age, depending upon what constraints are being imposed. Okay? Task constraints can make a big difference, right? As response complexity goes up, typically success, accuracy, and being in the right place goes down, right? Initially, from a developmental perspective. So, Would I expect to see that change a little bit just with a change in chronological age? Probably, but there's not a lot of adults who are good catchers, right? Adults who don't participate in ball games can still be novice catchers, right? So whilst there might be a relationship with age, it's not age dependent, it's experience dependent, right? I'm not a good catcher because I'm an adult. Trust me, I'm not a good catcher, right? As the distance to the interception increases, success goes down, right? The size of the ball can make a difference. As I mentioned earlier, a larger ball improves success with catching over a small ball, but it decreases the level of developmental sequence, right? It's a less mature, less competent pattern with a larger ball, but I'm more successful and therefore I enjoy it more, right? The trajectory of the object can be very important, right? The higher the trajectory, the lower the success, because the brain has to compute both the vertical and the horizontal component of the arc. So when I'm working with young children, they can't track an archy, like a tossy, archy rainbow shape throw very well unless they've had a lot of practice at home with mum and dad. So when I'm working with the children on the playground, I have to try to remember to toss the ball as flat as possible to give them the opportunity to make contact with the ball, right? So the bigger the arc, the harder it is, right? So that cricket chap that got that great big archy one and then had to look cool, because that's tricky, right? That's a very difficult skill. The colour of both the object, the ball, and the background can play a role. So the object colour is a task constraint, the background colour would be an environmental constraint, right? In the research, they talk specifically about having a blue ball against a white background. That piece of research was done with 7-year-olds. The colour of the ball becomes less important as you get older, as long as there's a contrast between the ball and the background, right? So one thing to think about if you're going to work with elementary age children is to try to make sure that your PE cupboard isn't just red and blue balls, that you've got a wide variety of ball colour, because one of the things that plays a role in catching is attention to the object, right? Well, if I hate the colour blue and you're throwing a blue ball, I probably am not going to pay as much attention as if I love the colour green and you're throwing a green ball, right? Again, that gets, as the children get older, that becomes less important, right? But having their attention to practice catching is important, right? Background colour, as I said, can play a role. Background is an interesting one when you look at home advantage. So there are many, many factors that play into the idea of a home advantage for sports. One of them is the fact that the home team has had much more practice at picking out the object against their background than the visiting team has, right? And especially if the visiting team doesn't get a lot of practice time when they arrive, then they're at a slight disadvantage because picking out the object against a new background takes a little bit of time to get used to, right? So, as I said, it's one of the factors. It's not the only one. There are a lot of reasons why the idea of a home advantage can be shown to actually exist. Right? The speed of the object, right? So it's not only how much force am I going to have to absorb, but it's how quickly is the ball going to get to the interception point, right? If you're doing practice with this, right, again, who am I practicing with? Because if I'm practicing with a novice catcher, it's quite important to try to keep the speed of the ball consistent from practice trial to practice trial, right? Rep to rep to rep. I've got to keep practicing, but if the ball is changing all over the place, that doesn't give me the opportunity to practice catching. But if I'm working with someone who's not a novice and they need to transfer that catching skill into a game scenario, then I want to vary the speed and the trajectory all the time, right? To give them as much practice at different options as possible. Right? Again, you can use that same idea with a ballistic skill with striking, right? So if I'm working off a ball machine and I'm a novice player, then I want the ball to come consistently out of the machine at the same speed, the same trajectory, the same angle that I've got to move to, right? But if I'm a very experienced player and I want to play well in the game, then I want to set the ball machine up so that every ball is different. And I've got to anticipate and move to get to every ball, right? So again, what I do as the teacher, how I set up the task, how I manipulate those constraints on my triangle is going to impact the learning and the developmental trajectory of the skill. Does that make sense? Ish? Any questions?
No, ma'am.
No? All right, let me see. How much of this do we want to do? All right, a little bit. Okay, so back at the beginning of the semester, we said that the ecological umbrella had two main subsets, the dynamical systems idea and perception action. When we're looking at the perception action information in the book, they are introducing quite an ecological approach. My personal background in perception action is very information processing based, because that's what I did at undergrad. And so for me, my comfort zone with the idea of perception action sits in the theory of calculation in the brain, right? The brain is doing some kind of mathematical calculation like a computer, right? So it's very information processing based. And so the perception action ecological view takes me personally a little bit outside my comfort zone, because I have to go, oh, okay, I see how that would work, but it's not my immediate go-to position, right? So what the ecological approach says that there are two characteristics that are used to catch consistently, all right? And so there are these very, what's the word I'm looking for? Very predictable patterns of change, all right? So the first one is called invariance. So these stable patterns that are involved in catching. And then, so stable patterns within my system or within the physics of ball flight, right? So it has to be a rainbow shape. If it's released at an angle, it will go up, reach a peak, and come down, right? And come in at an angle. That's just physics, okay? With gravity pulling on the ball, that's just what the brain has to learn. And then there's the expanding optical array. So this one I think is a little bit easier to understand than the invariance. That the pattern on the retina in the back of your eye expands or contracts depending whether something is moving towards you or moving away from you, right? So the rate of change of that expansion or, well, when we're talking about catching expansion, right? The rate of change could well be providing information for the brain on when the object is going to arrive, right? So I can perceive the environment directly. So this differs from an information processing approach because in this idea, I don't have to calculate where the ball is going to go, right? I don't have to do x-axis, y-axis, possible z-axis, right? I can just interpret information directly from the environment, right? So the possibilities are provided by these environmental cues. Goes back to the idea of affordances that I think we did earlier in the semester. Did we do affordances or did we have affordances coming? I think we did affordances. All right. So at this point, as an undergrad, I wouldn't worry too much about trying to understand invariance and stable patterns, right? I think that's more if we had two classes or if we had a graduate class. But this idea of the expanding optical array, I think is quite easy to understand, hopefully. You know, if you think about it, right, if you're driving along and the car in front of you is getting bigger, what would you do? Right? What would be your response to the car in front of you getting bigger? I hope what your response would be to the car in front of you getting bigger.
Get away from it.
You're driving down the road, right? And the car in front of you is getting bigger. What do?
Stop.
Stop, right? You put your foot on the brake, right? Hopefully, otherwise you're going to run right into the back of the car in front of you, right? So as an adult, did you even think about that, right? I would say probably not, because that's why you find it a little bit difficult to answer the question. Because you don't consciously go, oh, look at that, the car in front of me is getting bigger. That means I must be getting closer to it, so I better put my foot on the brake. No, you don't go through that whole conversation, you just put your foot on the brake because you directly perceive something that's occurring in the environment, right? But the learning that happened when you were little is that if something is getting bigger, that can't actually get bigger. Can a car grow bigger? No. So, the car isn't really getting bigger, therefore I must be getting more close to it. Right? That's not something you're born with, that's something we learn. Right? Through playing and games and practice and all those kinds of things that Mrs. Gard talked to you about in the play lecture in lab. Right? When I'm playing, I'm learning things like that. Not consciously, but in here. Right? Did the car grow bigger? No, of course it didn't. So I need to put my foot on the brake. Okay? Okay. So, I've got this grayed out, but I've got it as a slide because some of you are softball, baseball players. And there is some really fascinating information in this book about how catchers in softball and baseball manage to intercept a moving ball, especially, and in cricket, obviously, especially in those sports because the ball is so fast, like we couldn't even see the ball real time. They had to do a slow motion in order for the viewer to see the ball, right? So there's a lot of very fascinating research and really interesting information on that. I don't want to cover that in class. It won't be on the exam. But I wanted to point it out to you because if you are interested in those sports, this would be a really fascinating read if you haven't read it already. Okay? Very, very interesting material. But as I said, it's a little bit outside where I want to go in this class. Again, if we were in a graduate class, I would cover this. But as I said, if you are a baseball player or a softball player, you may well want to read that because it's really cool. Okay. So, given my rants over the first part of the semester, you know that it's important, I think, that we try to get young children much more competent in these fundamental motor skills. All right, the fact that I personally am a novice thrower and catcher is dreadful, right? I mean, that's just, it's poor, but I didn't do those skills when I was young, all right? So, we say children, you could replace the word children with novice, and then that could be anybody, right? A teenager, an adult, anyone, right? So let's again compare information processing with perception action. If I'm taking an information processing approach, then the errors that occur when I'm practicing provide feedback to the motor program every time. And that allows the brain to refine the calculation the next time it initiates that motor program. All right? So in IP, the brain is the computer. It has all these files. It's going to pick out a catching program, initiate that program, and then based on the feedback, error feedback that it gets, it will tweak the program before it files it away again. And then the next time it initiates that program, it will include the tweaks and see what happens. Okay. Now, if we take a perception-action approach, then the brain subconsciously discovers these relationships, right? It uses this rate of change of information on the retina. It would use the invariant relationship. Again, don't worry too much about the invariant relationship. Just understand that that's what's going on. It's perceiving information directly from the environment. It's not using error feedback to tweak a program for the next time I do the skill, right? So, that's a bad typo. Perhaps children learn that relationship, right? So maybe children subconsciously learn the relationship when they're standing still and learning to catch the ball, right? Or at least the ball is landing in their arms, okay? Eventually, they learn to move to keep the relationship between the ball and their hands constant. Much experience, parents, teachers, siblings, right? Lots of experience at playing with balls at school and PE, at recess, in the backyard, or out in the street if it's safe, right? And remember that we can manipulate constraints while that novice is exploring catching, practicing catching, playing with catching. Right? When I'm teaching it, sometimes I can, depending on who I'm working with, right? Sometimes the cue I give can be pointing out an important source of information to that person, right? Because they may not see that if they're not experienced. So, I don't know about baseball, but in cricket, the cricket ball has seams on it, and so I've heard people say, oh, I can tell by the seam what kind of spin was put on the ball. Okay, I would have no idea how to do that. I wouldn't even have known to look for the seam if someone hadn't told me to look for the seam, right? So that kind of, but again, it depends on who you're working with, because that would be way too much information for someone who was a beginner. Right? Unfortunately, not much research has been done on catching with older adults. If they're experienced and they've played catching type games throughout their life, then they probably know all the patterns, the flight pattern and things like that, then they're probably pretty good. What's going to impact them might be, you know, what if I have arthritis in my hands? Can I close my hands fast enough to catch the ball? Not that I wasn't ready to catch the ball, but I have a structural constraint that means I sometimes drop the ball, right? So lots of factors that might affect movement speed or the ability to reach they're going to be structural constraints, right? Or, you know, I've got arthritis in my shoulder, or I've got a shoulder injury, and so Ryan can attest to this, right? I have to rehab that injury, and then I've got to get used to moving and reaching for the ball again. He's nodding away at the back of the room there, right? He's like, oh yeah, he just had surgery on his shoulder, and now he's allowed to move his shoulder, but now you've got to get that timing and stretching back, right? So structural constraints can play quite a big role in the success of catching. Older adults can be slightly less accurate and more variable on these kind of lab type tasks, and they have seen that that's so, particularly if they are sedentary individuals. Right? But we also see research that says older adults can still improve if you give them appropriate practice tasks, right? There's some disagreement over whether they can improve as much as a younger adult can. So if I took a novice young adult and a novice older adult and I give them similar practice tasks, do I see the same level of improvement in their catching? That seems to be somewhat controversial. Some people say yes, some people say no. But I think the fun thing is that gives me hope is that as an older adult, if I practiced enough, I could actually become a somewhat competent catcher, which would be quite nice, really. So you do have to be a little bit careful with the research, particularly if it's before 2000, because a lot of it is going to be lab-based, not real-world based. Doesn't mean that that information is not important, but remember that the constraints in a lab are much less variable than the constraints would be out in the real world, right? So we would see some difference if we were looking at catching in the real world rather than catching or coincidence anticipation tasks in a lab. Okay, so driving and piloting. There's a little bit on driving and piloting in this chapter, which is quite interesting to look at. Especially, I think it's quite an interesting topic in the US because of the size of the country, right? And so many more people drive or fly in the US than maybe in the UK, especially at older age, right? So, you know, it's quite an emotive subject. Should someone who is 90 years old be driving a car, right? Not can they drive a car, but given the fact that we know that their eyesight might be deteriorating, that their reaction times are slowing down, that they're losing muscle mass and therefore aren't as strong as they were 20 years ago, should they be driving, right? So this is very difficult in a large country like this. In England, it would be very easy to say, you know what, you have an eye test every 2 years after the age of 70, and at the point you fail the eye test, you lose your driving license, right? That happened to my mum. Okay, she had some deterioration, she had some macular degeneration in her eyes, and they would keep checking on her, and at the point that she failed the eye test, lost her driving license. But there was a bus stop right outside her house, and there was a train station just down the road. So she hated it. She felt like she lost her independence, but really she lost her independence because she wasn't willing to go and get on the bus, not because she lost her driving license, in my view. I loved my mummy, but she was a bit stubborn about that, right? Now, what happens over here though? Right? It's miles and miles and miles to the Walmart, and there isn't a bus or a train. And I take your driving license away. Now what happens? Now I have to rely on other people to help me out, and that impacts my independence and my self-esteem. Right? So it's a very dodgy situation. I think it's a much more interesting situation in the US than in parts of Europe. Right? So maybe the primary kind of idea would be, what are the functional constraints that are changing, right? So my attentional focus, my coordination, my planning, right? All these things that are happening in my brain are slowing down as I get older, right? And then I've got structural constraints, so maybe I can't move my arm as well as I need to, or I'm not as strong as I used to be, right? Driving and piloting are both complex manipulation skills, right? So, again, in the States, most people drive an automatic car. So maybe that makes it easier to drive, because it takes out some of the manipulation that you would have if you had a stick shift. So what we see here is that often it's expertise that offsets the aging effects, right? Because you start driving so young. If I live to 85, I've been driving for 70 plus years, right? So that makes me an expert at driving, okay? And so that expertise, that knowledge of driving can offset some of the structural and functional constraints that are deteriorating sometimes, right? It allows me to compensate for the other constraints, right? And the more I drive, then the more practice I'm getting to maintain the skill. So you can see it gets complicated over, as I said, interesting over here. Do I stop someone driving, or do I encourage them to keep driving so that they maintain the skill as best they can? Right? It's important to keep doing the skill to maintain it for as long as possible. The question becomes then, how do we know when as long as possible is reached and they shouldn't be performing the skill anymore? Right? So, very interesting social issue, I think, in the States, as I said, versus a lot in Europe, because it's so much easier to get around. The land mass is smaller, there's more public transport available. The baker's is just over the road, so I don't have to go to Walmart to get a loaf of bread. I can cross the road and get a fresh loaf at the baker's in the morning. You don't have that, certainly not in rural areas, perhaps if you live in a big city in the States. Okay, so that, my friends, is all I have for you on that chapter. So, check the syllabus, just to make sure that I'm right, but Thursday should be our review session, and then Tuesday will be the exam. All right, so for Thursday, it's important that you have looked over the chapters, the notes, gone to the website, played with some video clips, practiced the ideas. Okay? And then if you've got questions on anything, we can go over those and clear up any issues that you have with the info on Thursday and do some little practice activities. All right? Also check, can't remember the deadline for the observation plan. But that's coming up. So check the syllabus, it's highlighted on the syllabus. Okay? All right, well have a lovely day. It's getting chilly here. We're meant to get snow tomorrow. It was 77 on Saturday. It's a little insane. So, although we could do with the moisture. So, fingers crossed we get rain or snow would be a good thing. And I'll see you